1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ah, voilà. Bonjour à tous, merci de prendre place pour ceux qui ne sont pas encore assis. Pour l'essentiel de la table ronde qui va suivre va être en anglais. Donc pour ceux d'entre vous qui veulent une traduction simultanée, il y a des micros, enfin des casques portatifs qui sont disponibles à l'entrée. Prenez-en un maintenant. Voilà. Et sinon, I'm sorry for our panelists that we begin on time for the French reference, which is 15 minutes late. So welcome everyone. This roundtable that I will have the pleasure and honor to moderate is about the link between science and policy making. As you probably know, in the climate issue, there is that sentence put into the mandate of the IPCC, which is that it should be policy relevant and not policy prescriptive. And what we are going to discuss in the 2 hours to come is basically, is it so easy to put a boundary or a limit between the two? A number of people, including our first speaker, have desired or wished to go from one side to the other. And actually, that is the person that we are going to begin with. So let me introduce the speakers. The first one will be James Hansen. James Hansen, we might summarize for the French audience his role as being the Pope of the US climate science. Is that okay with you? Well, you know now that the Pope is very fond of climate, as you have noticed. And he's been very well known for having directed for a long period of time the Goddard Institute for Space Studies of the NASA, which is, by the way, the website on which I still get all the convenient graphs for all the slides that they are not, they won't use today, most of them. James Hansen is also known for being a climate activist in a way. So he's been arrested a number of times, had handcuffs, you confirm, and which is something very unusual among the scientists of the field. So we will begin by an address by James Hansen of 20 minutes. And then we'll go through the other panelists, who will be Yuba Sokona, who is IPCC Vice Chair. Yuba Sokona presently works at the South Center as a special advisor on sustainable development. The South Center is an intergovernmental organization of developing countries and intended to meet the need for analysis of development problems and experience, as well to provide intellectual and policy support required by developing countries for action. He was, until May 2012, the coordinator of the African Climate Policy Center. He is also a visiting professor, I'm looking in my biography, in UK university, but I can't find which one. But sorry. Okay, Surrey University. And he used to teach in in Molière's tongue because he was also a professor at the École nationale d'ingénieurs de Bamako, au Mali. Then the third panelist will be Abel González, coming from Argentina, especially for us, thanks to him. Who is a specialist of the effects of ionizing radiation. He is presently senior advisor to the Argentine Nuclear Regulatory Authority. He is a member of the Commission on Safety Standards of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and he is member of the Argentine delegation to the IAEA General Conference and Board of Governors. But most of all, he represents his country with UNSCEAR, United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, a body that was created in 1955, and of course that will be at the center of what he says. And last but not least, we also had the pleasure of welcoming Sir David King, who is the Foreign Secretary Special Representative for Climate Change. But David King is also here because he had, so to say, two other parts of his career, which is being a scientist, a chemist, and also having been the chief scientist of two successive governments, that is the Blair and Brown governments. And that's, of course, going to be at the center of the part that Sir David is going to develop. And so with this introduction, I hope you have understood what we are going to discuss. And now, Jim, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thanks very much. I think the answer to this question, is it possible to design sound climate policy while ignoring science? I think we're seeing pretty good example that it's not possible, and I'm afraid that in fact we are ignoring science, and I'm going to be fairly critical of the situation that we have right now. Now I need to be able to control some slides. Let's see if I can do that. Does this, there we go. Yeah, I'm going to very quickly review the status of the present situation so we can spend most of our time in discussion. I think we all understand now that we have a climate crisis. The public does not really realize this because you don't see that much happening. The weather doesn't look that much different than it used to. But in fact, the climate system is changing, and it has inertia. It doesn't respond quickly when we change the composition of the atmosphere. It takes decades, even centuries, for it to respond. But it is in the process of responding. It's only responded about half of the warming that we will get from the gases that are already in the atmosphere. And that is a real problem because the amplifying feedbacks that occur we may leave our children a situation in which out of their control with major consequences. And it's a real tragedy because the actions that we need to take actually are not painful and they're not costly economically, but we're not taking them. And we're not even proposing them. Let me just mention the climate impacts briefly, and I focus on those that are irreversible, including the extermination of species and ice sheet disintegration, because it takes thousands of years for an ice sheet to build up from snowfall. So if we allow the ice sheets to go unstable and sea level to rise, that will be permanent as far as humanity is concerned. And I'll just show one chart on extermination of species. The coral reefs are the rainforest of the ocean. There are millions of species associated with coral reefs. But they're a good example of what we're doing to nature, where we're putting pressure on different species in several different ways. In the case of the coral reefs, it's both the warming ocean, which causes the coral to expel. If it gets too warm, they expel their symbiotic algae and die. And so when we have an El Nino, then a significant fraction of the coral reefs actually are affected by that. But in addition, we're making the ocean more acid. And that's bad for anything that has a carbonate skeleton. And we're losing more than 1% of the coral reefs each year. So that's an example. And we're putting stress on different species in many different ways. But if you combine that with shifting climate zones, then we can cause the extermination of IPCC estimates, if we stay on business as usual, that we will commit to extinction between 1/4 and 1/2 of the species on the planet by the end of this century. So that's one thing. The other irreversible thing is sea level. And we know from the Earth's history, the last time it was 1 degree warmer than today, sea level was 5 to 9 meters higher than it is now. And yet we're talking about possible warmings of even more than that, which would eventually cause even higher sea level rise. There are uncertainties as to how fast the sea level will rise, but in my opinion, it would, if we stay on business as usual, we are likely to get multi-meter sea level rise this century. We're working on a paper which will soon be published, which makes, I think, a fairly strong case for that conclusion. And that would mean that practically every coastal city would become dysfunctional. And more than half of the large cities in the world are located on coastlines. So the economic consequences would be incalculable. Almost the entire nation of Bangladesh could be underwater, and more than 300 million people in China live near sea level. So we really cannot let this happen. The IPCC models do not include the effect of melting ice sheets on the climate. If we put in the observed rates at which Antarctica is beginning to shed fresh water to the Southern Ocean, and the rate at which Greenland is beginning to shed fresh water to the ocean, and then we assume this is a nonlinear process, so it's probably better characterized by a doubling time than by a linear change, then we find that within a few decades we can get to a point where we're getting strong cooling around the Antarctic continent and even cooling in the North Atlantic. And that causes amplifying feedbacks, which actually causes the deep ocean to warm up faster and the ice shelves to melt faster and the ice sheets to send out fresh water to the ocean faster. So we're in danger of pushing the system in a way such that changes will occur faster if we stay on business as usual. It's another reason why we really have to begin to reduce emissions rapidly. And it's also worth pointing out that the climate change is not caused by today's emissions. It's caused by the cumulative emissions over the entire industrial era, because the CO2 stays in the climate system for millennia. And if you look at the cumulative emissions, we see that the West is much more responsible for the climate change than the developing world. The United Kingdom, where the Industrial Revolution began, actually has the highest per capita contribution. The United States almost the same, and Germany almost as high. China is an order of magnitude less contribution per capita, and India is so small you can hardly see it on the chart. So there are three, if you look at this from a standpoint of ethics, there are three huge potential injustices. One of them is, our parents did not know that they were causing a problem for future generations by burning fossil fuels. But we can only pretend that we don't know. We now understand this climate problem very well. And if we don't get off of this business as usual, we're going to hand our children and grandchildren a situation that's out of their control. The other thing is the north to south. We know that the north has burned the carbon budget for almost the entire planet. We cannot afford to continue and to continue to burn fossil fuels we've already burned most of what we can afford to burn if we want to stabilize climate. So we have to figure out a way. I mean, the North used fossil fuels to become wealthy, to raise the standard of living of their people. And of course, the rest of the world wants to do the same thing. But we can't afford to do that by burning fossil fuels, so we have to figure that out. And the other thing is, one species, humans, are affecting all the other millions of species. And again, that's, in a sense, ethical issue. The fundamental problem is that fossil fuels appear to be the cheapest energy. They're not really cheapest, but because they don't include their cost to society, they look cheapest to the user. So what we need to do is include the social cost. We need to add a fee to fossil fuel costs, which you would collect at the domestic mine and port of entry. And if you would give that money to the public, an equal amount to all legal residents, it actually would spur the economy, and it would move us off of fossil fuels over a period of time. Over the next few decades, we could actually phase out fossil fuels. But no governments are actually doing this. What they're doing is saying, oh, we will try to reduce our emissions, and we want each country to say it will reduce emissions. But as long as the fossil fuels are left the cheapest energy, somebody's going to keep burning them. That's crystal clear. We've done that experiment. In science, when you do an experiment which is well controlled and observed, if you do the experiment again, you expect to get the same result. And yet, we're not talking about anything different now than what we did in Kyoto 18 years ago. So Christiana Figueres says, many people have said we need a carbon price, and then investment would be so much easier with a carbon price. But, she says, life is much more complex than that. Well, that's baloney, in my opinion. There's nothing simpler than an across-the-board carbon fee. And the reason that it's more complex is you go to different governments and they say, no, we don't want to do that. We want to do what we want to do. And that's why it's more complex. But unless the major nations come to an agreement that they're going to put on a flat across-the-board carbon fee, I don't see how you can solve this. Because you can see that emissions, energy, this is energy consumption. That's accelerating because the population is increasing, and all countries would like to have a high standard of living, and that requires energy. If you look at the CO2, you'll see that coal has become by far the biggest contributor. Places like China and India, their emissions are going up rapidly, and it's mostly coal. But the science tells us we can't do that. And so what do we hear then? So the U.S. Energy Secretary and the John Podesta, who was Obama's principal climate czar, say, oh, we're very optimistic now because China and the U.S. have agreed to work together on carbon capture and storage. That is pure bullshit. India and China are not going to capture CO2 and store it. It makes the energy twice as expensive. And nobody wants this stuff buried under them. So they've been saying this for 20 years. Oh, we're working on carbon capture and storage. That's what governments say to pretend that they're doing something. That's not a solution to the problem. The only country that completely decarbonized its electricity, and that's the fundamental thing. If each country could decarbonize its electricity, the problem is solved. Because you can make liquid fuels from energy, from electricity, if you have carbon-free electricity. Well, Sweden did that with a combination of renewables and nuclear power they have carbon-free electricity. And now their carbon intensity is quite small. They still have vehicles that are using gasoline or petrol. But that, as I say, could be solved. Yeah, so I've gone through this quickly. You can get a more coherent version of it from my website, but I prefer to leave more time for us to have discussion. But let me say one more thing. This is two of my grandsons. The one on your left, Connor. You know, I don't like to worry my children about climate change. So I think it's really important that you not do that, because children are more sensitive than you might think, and they can easily worry about things. If you act like you're worried, they will feel that. And so instead, the thing that we do with our grandchildren is try to introduce them to nature. And one thing that I was doing with Connor was planting milkweeds for the monarch butterfly, which is one of the species that's being threatened by humans. But unaware to me, when I gave a talk in the backyard at a beach house where our friends had a house, I thought the grandchildren were already in bed, except for the oldest one, who's now 17 years old, and it's okay if she hears this. But Connor was only 8 years old then, as he is in this photo. And he was unfortunately in the audience. And at the end of my talk, my wife noticed Connor is a very sensitive boy. He's very quiet. He's frustratingly quiet, but a very sweet boy who's very sensitive. And there were tears running down his face. And my wife went up to him and said, "Oh, don't worry, Connor. Adults are working on this problem. They're going to solve it. You don't need to worry about this." Yeah, we should be working on it. But, you know, sometimes young children know when you don't just accept what you say at face value. And clearly he continued to think about this. And this summer, when he's an 11-year-old, he wrote what I find to be a remarkable statement. Because, first of all, he says that unless we can figure out how to make a time machine that actually works, they won't be able to go back in the future and fix this problem. And that captures the basic fact that what we're talking about here is a inertia problem with a decadal timescales. We understand the science of that very well. So we have to deal with the problem now before you have ice sheets collapsing and sea levels starting to go up very rapidly. The other thing he said is, which is also a fundamental thing, and that is grown-ups are scared of nuclear power, but he says we know ways to use nuclear power safe, and we know that using fossil fuels is not safe. It is very dangerous. That's the fundamental fact. And that's what we have to address one way or another, and we're not doing it. With the policies that are being talked about, emissions are going to continue to be very high. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I know it's going to be a little frustrating for the audience, but I suggest we proceed to the next panelist, and so that at the end we have plenty of time for questions. So, as I said, Yuba Sokona is IPCC Vice Chair. in this room, you've probably all heard the expression IPCC or GIEC en français. What you might not know precisely is what it is doing exactly, how, why, etc. So let me recall that the IPCC was established in 1988 in the, I would say, large frame of the United Nations. And the first question for Yuba Sokona is to explain basically what is the IPCC, what it does, how it does it, with how much money it does it, how many people it does it, and who are its, I would say, commanders. Who do you report to when it comes to, I would say, accounting for what you are doing?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part to this conversation and to be with the eminent personality scientists on this very important issue and question. And I'll try to provide a simple response to the question, and then the complicated one can come with questions. Well, there is two aspects of. And then the simple question is yes. And then to make policy, and then you need science. Is it happening? A simple question also is yes. This is what I will try to provide some element, and then the much more complicated one, we can have it through the conversation. Let me start with the why IPCC has been established when. And the initial task that has been given to IPCC as outlined in the UN General Assembly Resolution 43/53 of 6 December 1988 was to prepare a comprehensive review and recommendations with respect to the state of knowledge of the science of climate change, the social and economic impact of climate change, and possible response strategies and elements for inclusion in a possible future international convention on climate change. It started before the convention has been established. And as you can see it from that resolution, and there is a recommendation. IPCC should recommend. And actually, explaining IPCC and the work of IPCC, we said that we are policy relevant, but we are not policy prescriptive. And there is a nuance between what it has been mandated for the first time and actually for good reason, and then we can elaborate on that. And IPCC have so far produced 5 assessment reports. It's producing assessment report, special report, and methodology report. But let me focusing on the assessment report, since it has been established, and then to focus on one key message that you can draw from the report and how that informs policy. The first assessment report was in 1990. And then the key conclusion of this report is unequivocal detection not likely for a decade on climate. In the second assessment report in 1995, a key message that can be drawn from that is balance of evidence suggests discernible human influence. And the third assessment report in 2001, most of the warming of the past 50 years is likely due to human activities. The fourth assessment report, that is 2007, key conclusion or message is most of the warming is very likely due to greenhouse gases. And the fifth assessment report last year, 2014, a key message from that is human influence is clear. And then you can see the evolution of those different messages. And IPCC is science at the service of policymakers. And that means there is a clear relationship between IPCC and UNFCCC. We are here. And each of the assessment reports have informed number of decisions that has been taken with the Climate Convention. And let me start with the first assessment report in 1990. And then 1990, this assessment report led to the establishment of intergovernmental negotiation on climate. That has been established. And then the convention itself has been signed in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And the second assessment report in 1995 led to inform the Kyoto Protocol negotiation initiated. And then you can link all those different aspects to the key messages that can come from the report. And then the third assessment report in 2001, and then we start Marrakesh Accord discussion, and then it's only there we start discussing the adaptation, because the focus was so far on mitigation, its adaptation became prominent in the discussion on the climate change in the UNFCCC process. And then on the fourth assessment report, and that is in 2007, and then it provided an input to the post-Kyoto and long-term comparative action. And then some of the element has been drawn from that. And then the fifth assessment report in 2014, that is last year, and then all the discussion, all the process started with the INDCs. This is intended national determined contribution. And more importantly, in each of the assessment report, the assessment report also have informed and has been some of the element has been quoted in some of the key decisions within the convention itself, because this is the global policy-making body. I will just mention two of them. That is the third assessment report in 2001, while in COP8 in 2002, it recognizes with concern the finding of the third assessment report, which confirmed that significant cut in global greenhouse gas emission will be necessary to meet the ultimate objective of the convention. And then we recognize that during the 8th COP. And after the fourth assessment report, the COP13 in 2007 adopted the Bali Action Plan. And then the COP, responding to the findings of the AR4, decided to launch a comprehensive process to enable the full, effective, sustained limitation of the concentration through long-term cooperative action, now up and beyond to 2012, in order to reach an agreed outcome of adopted decision at its 15th session. And in COP16 in Cancun, they recognize that deep cut in global GHG are required as documented by the fourth assessment report, and then hold the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees above pre-industrial period, and all those, and then actually there's some discussion asking from the science to provide some information on 1.5 degree. And we, in the IPCC, we have seen a division of labor between the policymakers and the scientists. Because the policymakers need to navigate, they are navigators. And then if you want to navigate, you need guidance, you need a map. If you navigate in space or if you navigate in the ocean, you need a map. And then the role of IPCC is to provide a map making. In order to move from one place, a place A for a place B, you have different options, you have different possibilities, is to explore all the various possibilities and then to leave it for the policymakers in order for them and then to take the decision which route to take. This is up to them to do it. And it's important, and many also are saying that they see IPCC as doing research. IPCC is not doing research. IPCC is assessing the research, the literature, and then the findings for a certain period of time on the science of the climate, on the impact, and then explore also the potential solution in order to give to the policymakers, up to them to decide what action need to be taken. And in brief, those are some of the elements I just wanted to bring to your attention in order to stimulate the discussion and then to look at the much more complicated aspect of the question that has been put in front of us. And thank you for your attention.
I have one question that you can take it from there. As you know, probably the full assessment reports of the IPCC are 1,000 pages long. How do you expect any policymaker in the world to read only a fraction of this report and therefore to take the science into account in policy making? Because there is a true difficulty there, which is time.
Now, the assessment report itself, it is not for policymakers. What I try to capture is one key message from 2,000 or 7,000 or 5,000 pages. Because in the assessment, we have one report, and that is 3 volumes of the report. One is for working group, because IPCC is divided in 3 different working groups. Working group 1 is on the physical science, and then to understand all aspects of the physical science. And then the working group 2 is dealing with impact, vulnerability, and adaptation. And working group 3 on mitigation. And those different 3 volumes constitute the report of the IPCC. And then from each of those working groups are providing a technical summary and a summary for policymakers. What I did not mention is that from the beginning of the report to the end of the report is done in dialogue with the policymakers, because there is a scoping meeting, a scoping of the report where the chapter, the content, the issues that need to be discussed is defined, and that is done by the scientists and the policymakers. And then it's based on what issues, what perspective different policymakers from across the world are looking for. That is defined, is co-designed with the policymaker. And in the end of the process, we have a summary of policymakers. And this 20 pages document, and then this is the document that is circulated. And this also is co-produced with the policymakers. Because some will say, no, there is an influence of the policymakers, because there is no single element of the policy, the summary for the policymaker that is not supported by underlying report. There is no element that can be on the 20 pages, it is not supported by the main report. And then this is done and is discussed line by line with the scientists and the policymakers. And then the policymaker may say that, oh, what is written here is too complicated, it's not simple, what are the different elements? And then the scientists, they go back to main chapter and they redraft it. And this is how the summary for the policymaker are made. And then from that, since the 4th assessment report, we started an intensive outreach program. And then the outreach program that has been done this year have never been done through the start of IPCC. And then we have been in all the continent, in many countries, with different stakeholders, and then to discuss and then to present all the elements. And I think that this is also an area where we are putting more and more emphasis. And then to bring the report to the different stakeholders, not only the high-level policymakers, but the practitioners as well in the ground.
Thank you. Now we'll go to nuclear, so to say. In France, very few people know that IPCC has a kind of cousin, so to say, that is also a United Nations commission that was established in 1955. That is a special body to assess the potential dangers of ionizing radiation, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. Same question, but I've got more to follow. So could you explain in a couple sentences why it was created and how it operates and what kind of production has been delivered by this body?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. It's a big honor for me to be here, and thank you, Jean-Marc, to organize this important meeting with such a prestigious panel. Yes, in the area of radiation, the United Nations created a special committee, scientific committee, and in fact, it's the only scientific committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations. You may ask yourself, well, I mean, this politician in New York have a sudden impulse of science. Well, this was not the reason. I mean, the reason was that in the 55, the nuclear powers were exploding nuclear weapons all over the world, and people started to be concerned. The same type of concern that the first speaker mentioned about climate change, but this was about radiation. And this was the reason why the committee was formed. And I believe the committee was a success in that the explosions of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere were stopped. And the committee did a lot to make this happen. Many, many nuclear explosions have occurred, and the world was contaminated with a lot of radioactive material at the time. For that was the big success of this committee, UNSCARE. I am representative in UNSCARE from many, many years. I am really the older representative there, and therefore I believe that the reason of bringing me here from Argentina to here at a 20-hour flight is really my experience with UNSCARE, I presume that.
It might be an explanation. What are the links of the UNSCARE with the other UN bodies? Do you have organic links?
Well, that is a very important thing, a question. UNSCARE, like the IPCC, do not provide prescriptive policy, but provide policy. But if you just provide policy and there are not prescriptions about that policy, and I believe this will happen in climate change, then, frankly speaking, it's a very interesting intellectual exercise, but nothing happened. In the case of UNSCARE, UNSCARE provides the science, but there are bodies in the United Nations that make the prescriptions. These bodies are headed by the International Atomic Energy Agency and supported by all the organizations of the United Nations which are relevant, the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, etc. And all together, they establish a standard of safety with clear numbers, saying this is safe and this is not safe. And this is what the nuclear industry have to do to provide safe nuclear power. Therefore, UNSCARE is not prescriptive, but the United Nations became prescriptive. UNSCARE provided policy, and other organizations in the United Nations which have the statutory responsibility provide the prescriptions.
The UNSCARE, of course, assessing ionizing radiation, has looked closely and thoroughly at the two major nuclear accidents that happened on Earth, that is Chernobyl and Fukushima. I must confess that I was truly astonished when I personally read these reports, because they were saying about all the opposite of what the French press could say on these accidents. Could you say what are the main findings of these two studies or reviews, and what kind of material you have used to constitute the reports on Chernobyl and Fukushima? I mean, the UNSCR has used regarding Chernobyl and Fukushima.
Yeah, well, UNSCR did the tabletop exercise, let's say, about this, not about only these two accidents, among all accidents that have occurred in the world. These are two, but I don't know if you know that the majority of accidents with radiation are in medicine and not in nuclear power. But all of them has been assessed. But the real analysis in situ was done by a multi-international assessment. This was done for Chernobyl, the head was the IAEA, and now for Fukushima, this has just been finished just in September this year. I has been the leader of both studies, therefore I know the studies very well, and UNSCR was a part of them. And then all the information was incorporated into a report to the United Nations General Assembly. Well, the studies were very simple, were to go to the place, to really measure what has happened, to assess what effects has been there, and to report on them scientifically. And as you said, our findings were completely different from what the media was saying. And it's interesting that, you know, many big politicians were involved in the result. For example, people forget that in the case of the Chernobyl, the chairman of the final conference on Chernobyl was Angela Merkel. At that time, she was Minister of Environment of Chancellor Kohl. For Angela Merkel, at least among the politicians that I know, should know very well that the effects of a nuclear accident are not what the media said. I mean, we are not welcoming nuclear accidents, but the health effects of the nuclear accident that have occurred until now are really negligible. This doesn't mean that there have not been effects. The effects are many social and psychological. The psychological impact of Fukushima has been tremendous. But this has to do a little with this religion that has been created about nuclear.
If we talk numbers, can you say something on Chernobyl and Fukushima?
Well, in Fukushima, the health effects are absolutely zero, both at the public level and at the workers level. Absolutely zero. There are no health effects. The psychological effects are tremendous. This has a lot to do also with the local culture. For instance, I always said, we know in our language the word stigma, but we rarely use the word stigma. Well, in Japanese there are 6 words for a stigma. And even after being working there many years, I cannot understand the difference. One have to do with shame, another have to do with honor. For the psychological effects are very important. In Chernobyl, there was a big impact in the workers that were working in very, very bad conditions during the accident. 28 of them died due to radiation. And on the public, there was a big impact on children because a very, very big disapprehension, very big mistakes at the local authorities at the time. There was a big release of iodine, similar to the one in Fukushima. In Fukushima, there has been no effect due to iodine, but iodine goes to the thyroid through the milk. That is the main way is milk, go to the thyroid. The thyroid of children is very sensitive, and in Chernobyl, children were drinking contaminated milk like was normal milk because nobody have informed to the areas that an accident have occurred. I mean, in Belarus, they even didn't know that an accident occurred. As a result, there was a very big impact of cancer in children, 7,000 cases. The thyroid cancer is not, fortunately, is not mortal, therefore these children have not died, but nobody like to have his son with an operation of the thyroid, you know, to save their life.
When you look at the issue of climate change, maybe not in the papers owned by the Republicans, but generally when you look at the environment section, what you can read is aligned with the conclusions of the IPCC. As far as I know, this is much more rarely the case regarding nuclear, where most of the journalists I know don't even know of the existence of UNSCEAR.
Yeah, that is a...
Do you have an opinion on why?
Yeah, no, well, I believe it's a mea culpa. I mean, UNSCEAR is very well known at the scientific level in the nuclear area, let's say, or people working with radiation know very well UNSCEAR, they work with UNSCEAR. In the World Nuclear University, every year there is, in every course there is a class on UNSCEAR. For at this level, UNSCEAR is known. At the level of the public knowledge, decision makers, even at the policy level, UNSCEAR is not known. Well, I believe this is a mea culpa. I believe that we don't have the organization. I mean, UNSCEAR has a very limited secretariat.
You were in charge of corporate communications for UNSCEAR?
No, but the point that there is nobody in charge. And the scientists, sometimes they don't feel that need. Even more, there is a kind of psychological reaction to this contact with the press, frankly speaking. And I believe this is being corrected now. I mean, one of the major decisions of the General Assembly, UNSCEAR is reporting to the General Assembly every year. Every single year there is a report. Every 4 years there is a main report full of data. And in the last report, the General Assembly have instructed us to make a better outreach than the one that we have had until now.
Is it possible that in a number of papers, the people that I would say advocate and the people that are scientists talk to the same journalists, and it's difficult for the journalist to understand how to make the difference between the two? So we go back to the limit between the people who are activists and the people who are scientists. Or in climate change, there is no difference between the two. I mean, the activists basically base their action on the the conclusions of the IPCC. And in the nuclear field, at least in a number of countries, the activists base their activism on conclusions that are not that of the UNSCEAR. Do you think it gets just journalists lost, and it's part of the explanation?
Yeah, again, a mea culpa. I believe that we have been trying to avoid any of this type of conflict. I mean, the scientists working in this area has been very prudent is the word, I don't know, coward, maybe prudent, coward, something in the middle. And they have not been discussing these issues. And you know what happened? I tell you because this happened to me also. You get nervous when you are manipulated. I was involved in a film that the BBC, one important program, no? Horizon, one of the more important programs of the BBC, did on Chernobyl. And you know, they changed the information, they did things just to confuse the people, and you get fed up and say, go to the hell, I don't want any more to talk about with these people. This is a mistake, this is a mistake. I mean, we have to fight back, but mea culpa.
Well, thank you for this introductory part, and now we'll move to David King.
May I just answer the basic question first? Is it possible to design sound climate policy without ignoring science?
You'd surprise me if you said yes.
It seems to be obvious, but it's an incomplete question. You know what happened there? What is missing there? Is science ignoring his limits? And that is an issue that UNSCEAR has been discussing ultimately. The limit of science. If we want to be complete, we have to talk about the epistemological limits of science. And in the effect of radiation, there are things like that, and we can discuss during the question if you like, because it's an important issue.
Of course. So, sorry. So now we'll move to David King, who had the privilege of being both a scientist and, how should I put it, a consumer of science when in the government. And particularly, you have been the chief scientific advisor for two British governments, not of the same color. Can you basically describe what is this kind of position and what is the job that goes with it?
The post of British Science Advisor was developed by Churchill at the beginning of the Second World War. He decided he wanted a scientist by his side, and the system produced a professor of physics from Oxford, and the system every 5 years, I ran for 7.5 years, produces a professor usually from Oxford or Cambridge or Imperial College. And you're simply plucked out of the university sector and put into government. It has now grown, so the Government Office for Science, the staffing is in excess of 100 people, and the budget is very substantial. I think this is very important. You are not the sole advisor to the Prime Minister or the Cabinet. There is a team of people working for you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is then it is very much up to the individual chief scientist how you operate. You bring that mode of operation entirely yourself to the job. And so from one science advisor in Britain to the next, you'll find very different patterns. I think for me the most important thing was what actually happened outside of my control, which was a foot and mouth disease epidemic of enormous proportions that arrived in Britain in the year 2001, about 2 months after I had been appointed. Now what I did was very quickly get together a group of veterinary scientists, epidemiologists from the university sector, not from the government sector, to advise me on a daily basis, and together we set up models, mathematical, physical models of the epidemic that was happening, and I was able to go to the Prime Minister, who was, let me say, at sixes and sevens about what to do about this, and simply say what the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries is doing is wrong, the epidemic is out of control, but this is what we have to do. And we introduced a new control procedure, and within 2 days we turned exponential growth into exponential decay. Now I'm spelling that out because the entire cabinet was aware of this problem, and I was seeing the Prime Minister twice a day for 6 weeks. This was a massive national problem, and we resolved it by good science. So the answer to your question is, I don't understand how other governments can operate without a science advisory system. Because if you don't have the system, as I'm describing it, is a bridge between the best developments in the university sector and in public research institutions and government decision-making, if you don't create that bridge, you will be always behind the times with the advisors that you have within the government sector. What I was able to do was to pull in advisors not only from Britain, but from the whole world. I simply phoned up the best people in the subject area. Now what that meant, and there's a long answer to the question, but what that meant was that I was able then to operate on climate change as the reason I'd taken the job. I'm a very dedicated research scientist, and I had to give up that operation. The reason I took the job was so that I could raise the profile of climate change in the British government. Once I had the Prime Minister and the Cabinet's ear, they trusted me because of what we'd done on the foot and mouth disease epidemic. Then they took action along the lines I continually propagated for the next 6-7 years.
So I understand from your answer that this position enables the holder to propose and not only to answer questions when there are questions. And I've got a second subsidiary question, which is, you interacted with the government or with also with the House of Parliament?
Yeah, I interacted with both. And let me also say that when I took the job, I said to Tony Blair, I will only take this job if I can put into the public domain every detail of advice that I give you within the next 3 months. Right, so I give you advice, but you will know that my advice will go into the public domain. Now, that was a difficult thing for him to say yes to, but he agreed to it. And I held him to it. And that was a critical part of what I was able to deliver, because what I managed to do was keep the public, the Parliament, and the Prime Minister and his cabinet on side with these issues. I think it's fair to say that I became a very public voice on television, radio, all of that, because I was seen to be an independent science advisor within the government. That's a curiosity, but it's very, very important.
If we play the what-if game, assume that there had not been any chief scientist in the British government for the last, if I'm nice, I'm going to say since 2001, or even since Churchill. Do you think, what things would have been radically different in what we can observe today?
The British farmers would have been without cows, sheep and pigs, I can tell you that.
That's a difference.
Right. but let me tell
it's
you...
it's good for methane emissions,
much more importantly, from the point of view of climate change, I managed to persuade the British Cabinet of the following strategy on climate change, which is, let us do in Britain what we think every country should do and not wait to negotiate for that. And so what we managed to get finally through Parliament, and this was with all-party agreement, we got through a Climate Change Act of Parliament which commits our country to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050 and to be on a pathway steeper than linear in approaching that 80% reduction. We have already reduced our emissions by 30% compared with 1990. We will have reduced our emissions by 52% by 2028 because we have carbon budgets going forward in time set by an independent climate change committee. Now, I'm going to say that's not enough. I don't disagree with anything that Jim has just told us today. That is not enough. We all need to be switching to decarbonize our economies on a much faster timescale. I fully appreciate that. But nevertheless, that is the answer to your question. We would not have got that without, first of all, the foot and mouth disease epidemic, which cost the British government about £7 billion, but secondly, with the advice on action on climate change. Let me tell you how deep my pockets are on my actions on climate change. In the last 4 years, we have spent £4 billion mostly in least developed countries, but also in developing countries, on avoided deforestation, on actions on adaptation, actions on mitigation. And that fund, our own International Climate Fund, has just been re-established at £6 billion. So now that we've spent it up, we've got another £6 billion to spend. We have an $18 billion a year development fund that we're spending largely in least developed countries. That development fund is used for development with climate resilience and mitigation. We do not think that development without climate resilience is a possibility.
Do you know of any other governments that have chief scientists? And if so, trying to be objective, can you compare the results of what was achieved there compared to what was achieved in Great Britain?
Quite clearly, the United States has a chief scientific advisor and an Office of Science and Technology to back the chief scientific advisor up.
I know it's a tricky question with my neighbor on the left.
Well, I think Jim will know. the actual finance, and the United States is rather bigger than Britain, the finance is a little less than the finance that we have established in Britain around the office. So I don't think that, frankly, there is any other country that has as significant a weight behind science advice. But having said that, I'm not going to say that it is by any means perfect. It is not. If you just think about what I was saying in terms of where science today is at the best level and where decision-making of governments is at the best level, there's still an enormous gap.
I understand still that you are working on closing it. Let's take a country which is at the center of many concerns regarding climate change, which is China. As you know, China has the reputation of being led by engineers. So you might assume that science is playing a role in policy making there. What is your opinion on this? And do you have particular information on the interactions between science and policy making in this country, which is playing a key role in the issue?
Okay, the first thing I'm going to say is that the Chinese Politburo is very receptive to advice and information from outside China. That's very important because that is not true of all emerging powers around the world. If I can also mention another aspect of the job that I have now in our Foreign Office, I've got roughly 100 full-time climate attaches in our embassies around the world. No other government has invented climate attaches, let alone to have 100. And we were able to put 18 climate attaches into the embassy in Beijing to work closely with the government. I signed a bunch of memoranda.
18 in one embassy?
18.
In one embassy?
In one embassy, right? Because I signed a bunch of MOUs with the Chinese government. We have been advising them on their cap and trade process, carbon pricing, learning lessons from many mistakes we made here in Europe in that process. This is a critically important pathway to China's achieving across China by 2017 a cap and trade process. China's Politburo, you mentioned, engineering and science, amongst the Politburo, it's the most savvy government that the world has in terms of science ability. It is true that economists are beginning to move up in positions on that Politburo and even into the presidency. But nevertheless, these are all people who've come through outstandingly good universities like Tsinghua. So I think that in China, nevertheless, creating a role for chief scientific advisors is very important. Let me just quickly come back and say, in the British government, one thing I am very proud of, I was the only chief scientific advisor outside our Ministry of Defense. Every single government department now has a chief scientific advisor pulled in from the university sector to run for 4 or 5 years in that department. This is actually what is needed, I think, in every government today.
Well, that brings naturally a question, which is, you've been advocating tackling climate change. Have you been advocating putting chief scientists in all the other governments in the world?
Here's a difficulty. The answer is that I've been invited in to talk to quite a few governments, and I won't, I'll keep it confidential because these discussions were with...
So it's okay, only 100 people listening.
No, but inevitably, you meet up with the Minister of Science in that process, who very often has no scientific training, and that minister is worried about a person who would be appointed who would have a knowledge base that might overrun their ability to make decisions. Now, I worked very closely during my time, particularly with David Sainsbury, was my Minister of Science for many years. we worked very closely together. And I think that he felt his ministry benefited enormously from having this powerful science base within the system.
More generally, if you had, you're a little bit young to leave a will, but still.
Thank you.
If you had a will to make right now on better accounting for science in policy making, do you have a couple of practical, you know that British have two things, British humor and practical ideas. What are your practical ideas for this?
I mean, I'm going to take this opportunity to say I've also got grandchildren. I've only got two. One is 5, one is 1.5. I might have retired before now if it wasn't for my grandchildren. I think being able to discuss these issues, and I do take Jim's point about you don't always want to scare people, but answering their questions directly, absolutely critically important. So in a way, I'm not dodging your question, but I think what is needed is a far better interaction with young children about the challenges they're faced with and so on. And as they move up through the years, seeing that these challenges, and frankly, the 21st century has got the biggest challenge to civilization that we've ever had, right? This in the form of climate change, but also in the form of food production to meet the demands of 10 billion people, in the form of fresh water, all of these challenges. And our system of operating, and here's my biggest wish, is short-term thinking dominates. Short-term thinking. We think only in terms of the next electoral cycle for governments. We think it's very, very difficult to have a strategy which takes us to the end of this century and beyond. And yet that's what this century demands of us. So I just feel that has got to keep us all going and future generations going to see that we somehow move away from this wasteful way in which we are destroying the very ecosystems that give us our means of survival. Every scientist understands that, but not every scientist is standing up and making it clear.
Okay, thank you very much. So that will give me the opportunity to give the microphone back to Jim with two questions. You are definitely standing. And the second thing, you've been saying a number of times that you consider that 2 degrees is already extremely dangerous. Could you explain why? And could you say something on what you think basically scientists should do or should not do regarding this issue? Do you consider it's of their moral duty to do what you do, or it's anybody's choice and it should remain like this?
Yeah, first before answering that, I'd like to say, with regard to the discussion you've just been having, the British example and Sir David King in particular is really what we need. You know, in most cases, the advisors often feel that they are part of a team and they're sort of trying to make that government look good. And believe me, I've seen enough examples. I've gone to more than a dozen countries and met science advisors, and I wish that all of them had the independence to actually just give the best advice to their government, as I'm certain that David King has. It's frustrating that that whenever people become civil servants, they feel they're working for the government, you know, while they should be working for the public. it seems obvious, but it's not obvious it's not the way it's working. If we had that kind of advice to all of the governments, we would be doing things differently than we're doing now.
So, do you have an explanation on why it is not done, for example, in the US?
I've tried to make this point because, for example, a government scientist in the United States has to have, before he can testify to Congress, he has to have his approval, his advice approved by the White House. Now that doesn't make sense. And in addition, there's another similar example, which now suddenly I can't think of. But the point is that, again, it goes back to, are you working for the president or are you working for the public? And I try to make this clear, and you'd think that with the next, I thought when we got President Obama, I made a big issue of this in the Bush administration. And I thought, well, when we get a new election, maybe they'll change this policy. They haven't changed it at all. It's still, the other thing was the Office of Public Affairs. Every science agency has an Office of Public Affairs, and the head of that is a political appointee. And he feels that his job is to make the president look good. It doesn't make sense. You want to communicate with the public. The public is not well just informed about science, and they need to be. They need to get honest scientific information. And yet we've set up a system such that it's political. When a new government gets elected with the opposite party, they replace the heads of this. This doesn't make sense. And I tried to make an issue of that, and I had no impact. I don't know how to fix that.
And on the question on, do you believe that each scientist should partly or totally become engaged, or I can say an activist, or engaged in the public debate?
Well, not in, it can become all-consuming. To be a scientist, to be a good scientist, it's hard. It's more than a 40-hour-a-week job. So that's why I bailed out of it, out of public communication for 15 years. After my testimony in the late 1980s, I just realized this talking to the media and things, and first of all, I didn't think I did it very well, so I just bailed out and said, no more television interviews. And for 15 years, I didn't. But you don't have to, scientists do need to try to communicate. And we shouldn't waffle. I think we have to, of course, science tells you have to give the caveats, but it's possible to overdo that. It's for a young scientist, I think to become an activist is probably a bad idea, because you better first be a good scientist. And when you get to a point where you think you know something that's important, you should be willing to say it clearly, but not spend all your time doing it.
I've got the same question for Abel in the nuclear field. Do you consider that this topic lacks of people that are active enough in the public debate?
That is certainly the case, but I believe that there are two problems, three problems. First, one was mentioned that we have a too much tactical approach. Politicians have a too much tactical approach. What will happen tomorrow and the day after tomorrow? Nobody is interested in the future. And the scientists are contaminated with that. For scientists, usually should have a more strategical approach, but they are contaminated with that. The second problem is that people usually do not recognize the limitation of science. And usually the scientist is aware of that limitation of science, and the policymakers want the magic word. Well, we know that there are these limitations of science. The third point, and I believe that has not been mentioned and is very important, are the ethical values. And we have been contaminated, I will say, with the traditional consequential ethics, utilitarian ethics, the deontological ethic of the golden rule. And there is a new perspective arising that is based in a Greek word that have not easy translation. It's the word arete in Greek, which is translated as virtue, but it's more than virtue. It's an ethic of do the good even if you or your generation will not receive any beneficial from that good. And that is the ethic that is now permeating the scientific world, and it's our responsibility that we are not exercising to permeate that ethics in the policymaker world and in the media.
The word has been pronounced media. I will ask a very proactive question to you, but do you think that the media are rather allies of spreading the scientific facts, enemies, or I mean, because the oversimplification that they have to do, because they have to take 1,000 pages and summarize it in one page, is something that helps, or actually it would be better that they do not discuss at all the issue, and every government has a chief scientist that has hours to explain what the problem is about, and it's far better.
I think this is not an easy question because there is a lot of media. And then one cannot say that all the media are behaving the same. And it's also a bit difficult because they are in a society where, you know, the headlines are much more important than the real issue. And I remember some of the media just contact me and then to discuss climate change issues in Africa. And they're interested in bad stories on dead bodies, on deprivation, while I try to bring in to see the climate as an opportunity for the African country. Because the previous speakers talk about the decarbonization, and we are in Africa in a better position to take a carbon neutral route. 2 days ago, we launched in the African Pavilion one of the most important initiatives Africa have ever taken. And this is by now in 2030, 300 giga additional new and renewable in the continent. And then this is unbelievable, but the media will not be interested on those, most of the media will not be interested in those stories. They will be interested in the story that climate is affecting people, it disseminates people, and then displacement. Those are the things, and I think that is important also at the same time, government have climate scientific advisor, most of the big media also should have the same. Because it's, and then to take the benefit also of one of the important article of the Climate Convention, this is Article 6, on information, communication, education in a continuous basis, not in an ad hoc basis where there is extreme events.
You want to add something? Yeah, please.
Can I just quickly respond to two different points. First of all, Africa, and in a way this picks up on a very important point that Jim made about the cheapness of fossil fuel as a source of electricity. The British government is now going to use its $18 billion a year aid program with what you might say is a very ambitious notion, which is, and we will work with the French and the American governments on this, to roll out electricity to every off-grid village in Africa using solar energy with energy storage and microgrids. And we reckon we can do this already today 3 or 4 times cheaper than extending the grid to those villages. Now what this means is really dramatic in transformation for the people of Africa. We're talking about reaching more than 600 million people who today have no electricity over the next 15 years. That's our objective, and I believe we can do it. Now, we need the cooperation and leadership of African governments, and that's what they supplied the other day. Now, just in terms of the media, here's the biggest problem with the media. It is vested interests and the power of vested interests. So, particularly in the United States, the coal lobby system, which is funding nearly $1 billion a year into the anti-climate science debate. And what they're insisting on is that the media report what they're saying, at least equally with the report that the scientific community is saying. And so we're up against, let us not forget, these massive vested interests. And so it's fine to say, shouldn't we get better science treatment from the media? But don't forget, you will still get a lot of misrepresentation.
Necessary. You want to add something? Or?
Well, yeah, well, that point that David has just raised is the most difficult point. Clearly, in the United States, the media is just saturated with advertisements from the fossil fuel industry, which are high quality advertisements. The public is told that now with the energy, the fracking to get gas and fracking to get oil is enormously beneficial to the United States and to the citizens because it makes us energy independent, it creates jobs, and it's encouraging everybody to be an energy voter. And it's a very persuasive advertisement to many, because there's no, it's there, it's just the saturation. You can't turn on television without seeing this. And it's very worrisome because we can't do that. I mean, if we frack and get there's enough gas available and oil, and we're fracking to get oil too. If we do all of that, we can't solve the climate problem. And yet the public is not aware of that. They're made to believe that this is all beneficial. It's a real problem. We don't have public television supported by the government. We have television and media that's supported by advertising, and the people with the big, deep pockets can control the public's understanding. So we're in a situation where it has made it such that my hope is that China is going to lead a climate solution. I don't see the United States being able to do it because the public is brainwashed by all this money and advertisements. It's a really serious issue.
If it can be a source of comfort, in France we do have a public system for media, and they have open and they have let space to all the climate skeptics I know. So things are more complicated than that. We'll now take questions from the audience. So who's bold enough to ask the first question? Ah, Hervé. No, wait for the mic.
I just would like to ask Sir David King, how is the scientific counselor chosen and by whom?
The answer is very simple. It is headed up by normally the head of the civil service, but then the head of the civil service will get people from outside government to assist in the process. It is done by headhunting, right? So they go out and seek people to apply for the job, so it's actively sought, but the head of the civil service does run the show.
I think. Ah, okay. Oh, vas-y.
Hervé Bersegol, a scientist, a physicist working for the Atomic Energy and Alternative Energy Committee in France. My question will be to all of the panel. I'd like to hear about the science that we have to make so that we solve the problem. From my understanding, we have the science that says there is a problem, but I think that we don't have the solutions, because we know what we could try, and a lot of you have been saying what we should try, but I'm going to give two examples. First, we have to understand how economy works with energy, and especially when you inject those billions of pounds, are you sure that they are not going to put more oil on the market? And the other example is, of course, nuclear could solve the problem, but that's only if we build the fourth generation, because we know that we don't have enough uranium for the present generation. So are we making the fourth generation of nuclear plants? Thank you.
You have the mic, you start.
Yeah, well, I would like to say that the science, you know, I was told when I worked for the government, they would say, my superiors would say, make sure you only talk about the science and not policy. But, you know, the total problem is, does require objective thinking. And scientists are trained to be objective. And I don't think, I think you have to look at the whole problem. In fact, this is a complicated problem, which does get not only in physical science, but into economics and other things. So I don't think scientists should be prohibited from looking at the total problem. And, you know, that's where I think you come to the conclusion that you cannot solve the problem as long as you artificially, as you allow fossil fuels to be the cheapest energy. Then capping different sources and capping different countries, or certain countries being ambitious in reducing their emissions is not going to solve the problem. We have to actually recognize that we have to put an honest price on as an underlying policy. But then it becomes more complicated than that. There are other things we're going to need to do. There are other forcings besides CO2, and there are other actions, not just fossil fuels, but we've got to get the soils in the biosphere to take up more CO2. But I've forgotten what the question was.
You're doing well.
The first question was, what science do we need to solve the problem? And the second question is on one of your favorite topics, what about nuclear?
Oh, yeah. So let me just add something about nuclear and then pass the microphone. But, yeah, well, we actually have a lot of nuclear fuel. And both Japan and the United States have shown how you can sieve nuclear fuel out of the ocean. So we actually have a tremendous supply, and especially if you go to thorium. There's probably 3 or 4 times more of that than uranium. But nevertheless, you should close the fuel cycle. You know, I say let these alternatives compete. If we put the rising fee on carbon, it may be that 100 years from now we actually have figured out how to use renewables in a way that they could provide all our energy. We can't do that now. China and India, their energy use has gone up there, and it's almost all coal. And if we've got to get that out of the system, and I don't think there's any way to do it without the help of nuclear power. So we have to do that on the short run. And my suspicion is that on the long run, we'll figure out ways to do nuclear that are so much superior that its footprint on the environment will actually be smaller than that of most alternatives. Because you know, to get sunlight, you need a pretty big area. And I think, you know, what the people who say, oh, you can do it all with sunlight and wind or something, they're assuming energy use will actually go down. We'll use energy efficiency to get much more efficient. But the population is increasing. Other undeveloped countries want to have good lifestyles. So we actually need energy. So I think that nuclear has to be, even on the long run, is probably part of the story, but certainly on the short run, it needs to be part of it.
Yeah, we move left.
Sorry?
Okay. No, please go ahead.
I think I haven't got... there we go. So I think this is a very, very important question. We are fighting for our lives. That's the nature of the story we're in. Our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives. In the Second World War, when we in Britain were under attack, you know that we ripped up all of the garden fences that were made of iron and sent them off to be part of the war effort. For 5 years, the country managed to pull together under incredible situations. I believe we need to begin to put ourselves on that sort of footing to invest the proper amount in alternative energy futures for the planet. The G7 on June the 8th, heads of government, committed to decarbonizing the global economy during the period of this century. I think we have to do it in a very short time. We have to decarbonize the global economy. And in order to achieve that, we need to be putting a vast amount of money, not vast by comparison with the trillions of dollars a year that are spent on the energy industry, but vast in terms of, let's say, $20 billion a year on research that is mission-oriented, focused into delivering electricity and heat that is cheaper than fossil fuel energy, even without a carbon price. Now, I think we've got to do that because in the last 2 years, I've traveled to about 75 countries. I've made 75 official country visits. Some of them are repeats. There's not one nation within the developing and emerging power group that is prepared to spend more on creating electricity than the fossil fuel that they have at the moment. We have to make it cheaper to make this work. I think I'm going to disagree now with Jim. This might be the first time. Yes, nuclear is an important part of the solution. But between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, I don't think that is the most important part of the solution. I think for us up in Northern Europe, we don't have quite as much sunshine, and we will need nuclear energy. But if we look at the conversion of solar energy to electricity using photovoltaics and direct concentrated solar power, these are already solutions that are getting to be cheaper than fossil fuel. What we need is considerably more work on energy storage technologies and on smart grids. The feed-in tariffs across Europe, which started in Germany in 1989 and then spread right across Europe, have been the big subsidy that has created demand for both photovoltaics and wind turbines. And this has continually brought the cost of installation down by a factor of 15, 20, 30, and it's still coming down from $15 a watt down to $0.3 a watt today. The fossil fuel era has got to be considered to be over now. And what we have to do is work to provide energy for all societies, from renewable plus batteries, plus energy storage, plus smart grids, plus massive grid capacity across different continents. We can deliver all that, and I actually think we can deliver it in decades. I also think we have to.
It should work at some point.
Okay. You said you disagreed with something, but you haven't said it yet. Nothing you said after you said that disagreed with what I said. All I said was China, and I don't see how China and India can rapidly get off coal without the help of nuclear. I didn't say anything about low-latitude countries having to use nuclear.
So I think my position is very simple, that if a country has a significant amount of desert area, and I did go into Modi's government 2 weeks after he was elected. They've got in Gujarat and Rajasthan very significant desert areas. They can provide, using solar energy, virtually all the electricity they need for the country. Equally, China, massive desert areas, and they can farm the solar energy very efficiently. Now, I think what I'm saying is, yes, in the shorter term, roll out nuclear energy, but in the, and I don't even mean long term, I'm saying by 2040, 50, we will be able to roll out cheap renewables plus smart grids plus energy storage to compete successfully.
Yeah, so but they have to do that by competing. That's why you want a fee on carbon, and then the solar and the nuclear can compete in those countries. And I think on the long run that may be the case, but on what we have is really a short-term problem. We realize now that we're really close to pushing our children and grandchildren into a situation in which climate is out of their control. And that means China and India, and then maybe Indonesia, they're now number 7. They're moving up fast. So anyway, I don't really think we're disagreeing.
Abel, you wanted to say something?
Being here in the
If you can.
In the left wing, it's very difficult. But the question was very good, very concrete, and I will try to answer the 2 questions. First one, what to do?
Mic closer.
First of one, the first question was what to do, concrete. Well, I believe that in climate change it's necessary to follow the example that we have given in the radiation area and to move from science policy to prescription. We are missing the international prescription. In radiation, science is provided by UNSCARE, but then there is international prescription. And let me say the following. You do not give international prescription just with conventions. The conventions are written by lawyers, and therefore used for getting money to the lawyers and not to solve the problems. If you want to go to prescription, you need concrete standards, numbers. And this is not done in climate change. This to the first question. Second, nuclear. I fully agree with you that we need to use the full cycle and to abandon this religion started by President Carter, that if you use the full cycle, you are proliferating and etc. I agree with you, but I also agree that we have enough resources to go for nuclear now. And now my dissidence what has been said. I frankly believe that solar, wind and etc. are real red herrings. They can solve the problem of same problem today or tomorrow, but they cannot have a strategical thinking. I am not pro-nuclear. I would prefer that somebody get the Nobel Prize getting energy from water. But from the time being, I believe that the only real solution, a strategical solution to the problem, is nuclear. In all countries of the world, is nuclear. The red herrings are very nice for the newspapers and for solving the problem today or tomorrow. But the red herrings, meaning solar and wind, will not solve the strategic problem of energy of the world. Thank you.
We are running out of time, so I will take... people are more courageous now. Well, too bad. So I will take 2 questions, and I'm afraid we have to wrap up.
Yes. Jean Sirejol, from the TACA Association, French association. TACA in French means just do it, sounds like just do it. So TACA reduce your carbon footprint, but TACA is also for tariff carbon. So we are very close to James Hansen position. And I wonder, what is a sound climate policy? I'm not sure that the scientific aspect is the main one, because for the climate issue, the science is crystal clear. Our problem comes from the greenhouse gases. We have to reduce this. Our problem is, why don't we reduce these greenhouse gases? My proposition is that we consumer, in English, it's obvious, we are at the center of the problem because consuming is heating the planet. So we consumer have to drastically change. And how can we change consuming? By putting a signal price. This is completely obvious. I would like your thought about this obvious statement.
Okay. There was a lady right by you who wanted to ask a question. Yes, there. It will be the last question. Marion. Là. Yes.
Hi, my name is Taiwei from Emory University. My question is to Dr. James Hansen, but any comments from the other panelists who wants to chip in. So we've talked about the importance of interest in America, and a certain party in the United States has already announced that they're not going to support any deals that Obama make in Paris. So I was thinking, I want to ask, so what does it take for Congress to turn around, particularly a certain party in Congress to turn around? And related to that, what role do you think the renewable energy industry can play in lobbying? And do we see them playing an increasing interest in lobbying the Congress? Thank you.
Yeah, I've spoken. The problem in the United States, the Republicans are strongly against actions, but in fact, I've spoken with a number of the conservatives, and they understand, the thoughtful ones understand that this is not a hoax, that climate change is real, that humans are behind it, and they're becoming concerned that when the public understands this, that the public will demand the government solve the problem, and that will mean regulations and taxes and everything that conservatives don't like. So they're actually willing to consider a revenue-neutral carbon fee, and I think that's the solution, because otherwise, in a democracy, we cannot have a carbon tax. You don't really like a tax anyhow because it depresses the economy. But a carbon fee in which the money that's collected from fossil fuel companies is distributed to the public is I think, what is needed. And I think that's what conservatives and liberals can compromise on. And we have to, and it's just a matter of getting enough people to understand this. That's why, you know, there's actually a sign over here about Citizens Climate Lobby. That's an organization that was United States only. Now it's in several countries and it's growing rapidly. And their whole objective is to get governments to agree to a rising carbon fee with the money going to the public. None of it going to make the government bigger. And I think this is the fundamental thing that we need.
I think that for the first question, we all need to put an emphasis on communication, information, education on a permanent basis, and then to get all the people in Paris or in different regions in France. For the preparation of the COP, I have been in 3 different cities in France to give talk on climate issues. And this should continue. It is not because there is a COP here, those kind of events should take place. If we do it in a continuous basis, so that the general public will get educated, and then they will, we need to change. And this is very important, education, information, and communication on a continuous basis.
A very quick answer to the question about consumerism. I think that is a critical, important factor as well. Our economies around the world have been developed on the basis of the linear economy, essentially taking materials from the planet, turning them into marketable goods, and then junking them. The circular economy is the only way forward in the 21st century, and we need to be looking much more carefully at how we can accelerate the process of change in our consumer behavior from that linear, wasteful economy, damaging to the ecosystems, into a more caring sort of circular economy. That to me is the other part of this equation. But let's just solve the energy question first.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, nobody's hearing, and no, I'm sorry, nobody's hearing. So, yeah, sorry. Are you? Do you agree to end 5 minutes late? Yes. Okay, so we'll take 2 more questions.
Thank you. Mirta Tripathi, Global Compact. My question goes to Sir David King. Climate change obviously is a global problem that one country cannot solve by itself and needs the help of the others. Britain has done a lot regarding fighting climate change, in particular by restarting its nuclear program. I remember a couple months ago asking a British official what they would do to try to convince other countries to do the same and go down that road of restarting the nuclear program. And he answered me, well, I only pick the fights I think I can win. I wanted to know what you thought of that statement.
I mean, I'm not quite sure that I get the gist of your question, but let me try. I think that the answer I have is, this is a problem that we have to deal with. There's no choice about this. When I went around in 2004 to 2007, around the whole world, trying to drive home the idea that what we were doing in Britain was going to reduce our emissions to less than 2 tons per person per annum by mid-century, and we wanted other countries to do it, you would be quite surprised to know the number of times we managed to make progress. Now, let me just say, I spoke to President Lula. I said, my Prime Minister says we're doing this, and what would you do in response to assist that process? And President Lula didn't give me an answer, but his environment minister, who you may know, at the COP meeting in Poznan said, the Brits are boasting that they will reduce their emissions by 80% by 2050. Let me tell you what we will do in Brazil. We will stop all deforestation across the whole country, not by 2050, but by 2025. And Marina Silva, during her period as Minister for the Environment, achieved 80% of that by 2008. So I think by challenging people to do what seems impossible, we can get really quite remarkable results. I think one should never give up.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurd from the University of Adelaide, and I have a question for Sir David King. You made a statement earlier that off-grid solar systems, for example, would be able to be provided at a cost perhaps 3 to 4 times less than grid connection. But in light of the fact that that doesn't provide the same service, quantity and reliability as a grid connection, that comparison is somewhat moot, I think. So I guess on behalf of everyone in the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, I'm wondering, is that seriously proposed as a permanent solution? And if so, how many kilowatts per household are intended to be installed under that type of a program? Which country will be responsible for manufacturing all of those solar panels, which I presume will happen in an industrialized economy? And what quantity of electricity and level of reliability would such a system provide, and how would it compare to the level of service and reliability enjoyed by, for example, everyone under this roof?
You will be rather surprised to know that we have examined each and every one of those questions and many more in running forward this policy to roll out across Africa. We will provide reliable electricity, but only because we are coordinating our policies with learning processes, with developing the capability of people who will manage these. The business of giving a lorry to a small village as a means of improving their abilities to get around, we know the result of that. They end up as chicken coops unless you have the mechanical engineers and so on. Believe me, we are looking at this in the round. Now, it seems to me that underlying your question is a complete misunderstanding, which is that you can now buy, if you live in California, solar photovoltaics for your roof, and you can buy from Tesla for $3,000 a battery system that you can run as a household, and you can store 7 or 8 kilowatt hours of electricity in that battery system. Now, I'm simply saying the cost of that is about $3,000. We need to be looking, of course, at energy storage, and that's why I think research, development, demonstration is absolutely key. We need to develop new technologies for energy storage that bring the price down substantially. The Samsung lithium-ion battery systems are here now, and we can use them. As we roll this program forward in Africa, in other countries, we will see new competitive technologies coming into place, and we will see the benefits around the whole world, just as we've seen the benefits of cheap photovoltaics now becoming available for the whole world, resulting from the subsidies emerging out of Europe. I mean, you're now talking out of your hat. I can assure you that we've examined this in very fine detail, and we listened to people like you and managed to find answers to questions about photovoltaics when they were at $70 a watt. So I think we just need to understand the following, that the fossil fuel era has been over 100 years long. It's a very mature set of technologies that has emerged from that. In order to compete with that, with renewables, with storage, with smart grids, we have to subsidize in the first instance, or create a market, which is what African leaders are doing with us, to pull forward the production capacity to meet all of the advantages that flow from that. Now, this isn't pie in the sky. We've got N different ideas coming forward to meet all of this. Now, if you want to roll nuclear energy out around the world, great. I'm not against nuclear energy, but I don't think you're going to manage it in the time frame that we're going to manage the project that I'm talking about.
If I may, there was one question about the figures. If we take the figures, let's say somebody living in Europe gets directly and indirectly, industry included, a little less than 10,000 kilowatt hours per year of electricity. What would be the typical figures of the system that you have just described? Is it the same magnitude, 10 times less? Well, that was on the questions. Or you can say it depends. But
we just finalized a proposal for Africa. This is Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. And this initiative, as I indicated, is between now and 2010, in 2020 to have 10 giga of additional capacity of renewables in the continent. And then between 2020 to 2030, 300 giga in the continent on the renewables. And then we made the calculation and the basis to take up an average, taking the case of Brazil, it's almost 2,500 kilowatt per person per year. And then we take that as a basis. Okay. And then there is no single solutions that can be applied across everywhere. And then we have the opportunity, actually, a combination of different renewable energy technologies. Solar, in some cases, is the best way to go. It will be from isolated to mini-grid to feeding the global system. In some cases, wind energy. In some cases, it's biomass. And then we have the opportunity, and then we made also a business case of all the cases. And then we look at the productive sector, and then not focusing, first of all, on the household. Productive sector, that is the small-scale farming system, less than 2 hectares. Because the bigger, the larger part of the economy is come from the farming system, less than 2 hectares, and then we look at what are the energy system and the energy options for those small scale. And then we made the case in that, but there is no possibility to say that this is a unique solution and that can be applied everywhere.
Okay. I think Abel had you will probably get the final word before everybody makes a very short conclusion.
Well, I myself am very much in line with the implicit question that was presented. As you know, I am coming from a very sunny country. I mean, we are not equatorial, but it's very, very sunny, the north of Argentina. What probably you don't know is that we are a very windy country as well. I mean, Patagonia is probably one of the biggest reserves of wind. But we have put a lot of our money in nuclear. Therefore, there are 2 options. Either we are masochist, or we made some numbers and came to the conclusion that there is a red herring behind all that options.
Would you like to add a word of conclusion for the... yes.
Well, as a conclusion, I am very happy with this discussion, I will say. I believe that there is a lot of contribution that the radiation science can make to climate science, and vice versa, of course, always happen like this. I believe that what we have done in radiation is a very, very solid science base, but we have not stopped there. We have gone to international prescription. And that I believe that this is missed in the climate side. And that is possible. International prescriptions mean standards. And mean standard for all countries, but particularly for the majority of the countries which have a Napoleonic codification. They have not a common law system of very, very admired common law system of UK. And when you have a codified system, you need a standard, you need numbers, clear number, what can be done and what cannot be done. And that I believe that is the future, in my view, for climate change. Thank you.
You, no, no, no. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. So you will. I mean, if you can grab the speakers after. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We have to leave the room afterwards. Yuba, do you have a word of conclusion?
I think we need more interaction, interaction between science and policy. And the science cannot respond to a single, simple questions, and then to give a simple figure that can be applied everywhere. And then there is a wide range of possibility, perspective, and then there is a need of frequent and continuous communication between science and policy.
David, one last final word? No? Okay.
Well, I'm broken record, but I agree with the fact that we need to find energies that are cheaper than coal. But at the same time, we have this real emergency in the case of climate, which means we have to phase out fossil fuels, and that means we have to make their price honest. We have to have a rising fee on carbon, and it's not difficult. It's not going to be painful if we would do it in a sensible way, and we have to force our governments to pay attention to the public's interest rather than the lobbyists' interest, because that's the only thing that's preventing us from doing what is sensible. And it'll be a terrible tragedy if we continue on this path many more years, because otherwise, if we do, we'll hand our children something that's out of their control.
What I do want to finish with is the following: that at the moment, the total subsidies for non-fossil fuel energy sources amount to around $100 billion a year, $150 billion perhaps. The total subsidies today for fossil fuel energy sources are about $500 billion a year. So I would say the very first thing that governments have to do is remove subsidies for fossil fuels. They operate in many different ways, and the very first thing we should do is encourage governments to remove them. I want to then congratulate the Indian government. They have now virtually eliminated the fossil fuel subsidies that were heavily operating right across the country. One government after another needs to follow suit.
Well, thanks to all of you. I'm sorry for all the questions that we couldn't answer. And again, thank you very much for your thoughts.